we are going to look at a region in Central Eurasia or Central Asia that we might call the Mesopotamia of Central Asia. This is the region of the Oxus and the Jaxartes rivers, or the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya as they are known now, home of what we might call the Oxus civilization, which is also known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. So I am actually going to devote 2 or perhaps even 3 presentations to exploring this civilization. In this first one, we are going to begin by looking at an interesting settlement. And this is the settlement of Shortugai, which is in fact a Harappan colony established in this region. And just to say this, that there is a Harappan colony or a Harappan settlement in the middle of Central Asia is pretty amazing. And what was this colony doing here? When was it established? How was it discovered? And what are the implications of finding this settlement here, which was founded sometime around 2500 BC, which remember is the period during which the mature Harappan phase or the centralization phase of the Indus Valley Civilization, in which all of the greater Indus Valley zone is integrated, also occurs. So this site was discovered by a survey team led by Professor Jean-Claude Cardin, Pierre Gentel, and also by Dr. Bertille Lyonnet in the autumn of 1975. So these archaeologists were part of a larger French team, and they were all operating in this region of Afghanistan and the southern USSR, which are the Central Asian stans of today, of Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. And they were operating here primarily looking for Hellenic sites, and they were excavating this important city of Ai-Khanum, which was one of the Alexandrias founded by Alexander the Great. So while conducting these explorations all around this region, they were also interacting with this other legendary Soviet archaeologist called Viktor Sariandi. And Dr. Sariandi had in fact discovered many ancient sites dating to 2500 and even 3000 BC in this wider Oxus and Jaxartes zone. And they were surprised initially to find this strange looking settlement whose artifacts they couldn't identify. So they reached out to Professor Louis Dupree, who was in Kabul at that point of time, and they sent him some photographs of the pot shards to show him the signs, the strange signs which they couldn't identify in place, which were on them. And Professor Louis Dupree immediately recognized them as signs of the Harappan civilization. To confirm this further, they reached out to the Archaeological Survey of India, where Professor B.K. Thapar, who was the excavator of this other vast Harappan site of Kalibangan, saw these artifacts, flew up to Kabul and confirmed that these were artifacts of a Harappan settlement in this zone. And the more interesting thing was that this settlement was founded by these Harappans who came to this place as colonizers. Because before the Harappan archaeological layer, there was no settlement in this specific spot where the site of Shortugai was established. Of course, Shortugai is the present-day name of the village near where this site was found. Now, subsequent and more systematic excavations were also carried out here in 1977, 78, 79, and this revealed important insight into the chronology of this settlement zone. Now, the archaeologists found that this site was established sometime around 2500 BC, and it was established by Harappans who possibly came here with lots of settlers, which might have included perhaps hunters, artisans, builders, and perhaps even some bureaucrats to oversee the entire construction and establishment of this colony. So Professor H.P. Francfort writes, "We can notice that these settlers arrived and they were well equipped with their original cultural material set, that is architecture, pottery, arts and crafts, and even imported species of plants and animals. So they dug irrigation canals to take water from the Kokcha, which is a tributary in a sense of the Oxus and not too far away. They made low, deep terraces, and they also built some monumental architecture, which included one central building and some walls around this entire settlement. Now, this wider region wasn't completely uninhabited. In fact, in some sites around this region, There are hints that the local people were also beginning to found this agriculture based society. So there are hints in this place known as Sarazm of irrigation technique and terrace agriculture. And in fact, in subsequent excavations in later decades, more sites have been found around this wider region in this place known as Arki, Talukan, Askalan, Kalafkan. And of course, these are all clustered around Shortugai. And in the wider zone as well, we have found various settlements, especially around the Oxus, going back even to the 4th millennium BC, of which the most famous, in a sense, is Gonur Depe, which was excavated by Victor Sariandi, and which was known at this time when Shortugai was also excavated. So just to complete the chronology of this site before we get to a more wide-ranging discussion regarding the implications. So this was the earliest period of settlement known as period 4, which lasted till about 2000 BC, so 300 or 400 years. Then after this, beginning from period 3, we find traces of local influence in the settlement. There's no trace of violence, but local traditions of architecture, metallurgy, stoneworking, and ceramics also evolved in this wider region and can now be seen even in Shortugai. Then the site was briefly abandoned, and from around 1700 BC, we find a new culture taking root, which is completely indigenous and has no traces of Harappan influence left. But this is a long period, about 600 or 700 years. And remember, throughout this long period, there is no trace of violence in this vaster site. The site is abandoned for a brief period of time and reoccupied, but this does not happen as a consequence of violence or the destruction of the site. And this final period lasted till about 1500 BC, when the site was finally abandoned and then forgotten till it was discovered again in 1975. Now, how do we interpret this site or its presence and its location in a historical context? Of course, we don't have any written history for this site, but how do we make these wider world systemic interpretations? Now, one of the most important discoveries in recent times is that just across the river from Shortugai was another settlement which was contemporary with this settlement, this Harappan settlement, at the place known as Farhor. So in a sense, Shortugai was a place where these two civilizations, the Harappan and the Oxus, looked face to face. Now these were not imperial outposts in a sense, because again we find no signs of fortification or any sort of military occupation, or that these sites are military camps or even forts. Most likely these sites were there for interaction of a different sort, that is trade, or perhaps even to control trade routes which came down especially from the east. Now metals are one of the important mineral resources in this region, but there is another important resource, and that is lapis lazuli. And lapis lazuli is found even today in the Saresang mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan, and this is not far away from the site of both Shortugai and Farhor. So this was one of the hypotheses, that the site was founded to derive lapis lazuli from very close to the source. And there is some hint that lapis lazuli was worked and beads were made at Shortugai. But more likely, the lapis lazuli that was derived here was used for perhaps packaging and processing for trade to the west, and especially to Mesopotamia through the North Mesopotamian trade route. That is, there was a trade route perhaps till the Caspian, and then from there southward towards the cities of Mesopotamia. But there is another important resource which is available in this wider region, and that is gold. And in fact, some traces of gold have also been found at Shortugai. There are still other hypotheses that Shortugai was perhaps established for purchasing or even capturing some kinds of animals. There is a hypothesis that this was done for Bactrian camels. And yet again, perhaps at a later stage, this site was also used to derive horses around the turn of the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC. Now we do know that during this mature Harappan phase, the Harappans were very enterprising. And as I've discussed in other lectures devoted to the expansion of the Harappan culture, the Harappan integration during this greater Indus Valley civilizational phase, Harappans established vast number of colonies and cities during this phase, all within a period of 100 years. In the west, we have the furthest colony at Sutkagendor, which overlooks the Straits of Magan. In the east, we have colonies right in the northern regions of the larger Gangetic Valley. And then, of course, in the north, we have this site at Shortugai. So the Harappans were enterprising, and perhaps there were some enterprising people who built these colonies in faraway places, traders and merchants, to derive all sorts of profit. And we should not just look for one explanation, and this was perhaps just a consequence of human enterprise, of merchants going out and sort of settling and occupying this frontier zone, where they could interact with these frontier people and derive all sorts of benefits from this interaction. But more importantly, from around 2000 BC at Shortugai, we begin to see a confluence of Harappan and local Oxus civilizational culture. And this integration also seems to be happening over a much wider zone, spreading into present-day Afghanistan, to the fringes of the Indus Valley, and even into Iran, at the site of Shahar-e Sokhta, where we find evidence of the older Elamite culture coexisting with Harappan culture and also being influenced by this Bactria Margiana or Oxus culture. So remember, these frontier zones are places where different types of cultures interact, different types of settled cultures, but also, importantly, different types of moving cultures. And just to the north of this Oxus civilizational zone, or perhaps all around it, was this wider cultural area which is known as the Androvno culture, which is a culture of steppe nomads. And we also have evidence that these people were interacting with the settled people of these cities of the Oxus civilization. And even in Shortugai, we also find traces of the Androvno type of pottery, or pottery which was used by these steppe people. So these people were also being influenced by these settlements in this wider zone, and the settlements themselves were also being influenced by these people. Now, I mentioned that these moving people were often carriers of trade between these settled zones or in the wide open spaces in between. And since we do find evidence of Androvno people in these various settlements in this wider arc of the trade network of the 3rd millennium BC, these Androvno people were perhaps carrying these goods and providing their services, perhaps these intensive manufacturing zones where these raw materials were being processed. And perhaps they were also offering different types of services, such as of mercenaries. Now, we know from the history of other empires, such as, say, the Roman Empire, that of these nomadic people living on the fringes of settled civilizations are often employed as mercenaries. In fact, even in China, which becomes one of the key players in this Central Eurasian geopolitics from the 2nd century BC. But we are still far away from that time period of history, which of course we are going to get to in time. Now, more importantly, there are some other historical interpretations which H.P. Francfort makes. Now, I'm going to quote from one of his articles on this site. He writes, "Shortugai is revisited with the help of the recent finds at Farhor and with reference to the works of V.I. Sariandi, or Sarianidi. I mispronounced that name throughout this lecture, so apologies for that. V.I. Sarianidi allows proposing some preliminary historical interpretations. The Middle Eastern connection, especially with Elam and Mesopotamia, can now be re-examined thanks to the excavations at Gonur Tepe by V.I. Sarianidi. We surveyed extensively the evidence for the publication of the Shortugai monograph, and then a couple of years ago with the late Xavier Tremblay, and proposed that the land or kingdom of Markhasi or Marahasi of the ancient Mesopotamian texts could have been the Oxus civilization rather than the Kerman region for many good reasons. Among the characteristics of the Markhasi region or the Marahasi region is generally recognized its close ties and proximity with the land of Meluha, that is the Indus Valley Civilization. And of course, Indus artifacts, seals and objects and pottery were also found at Gonur Tepe, and there is a spatial direct proximity between these civilizations in this region, between these settlements in this region. On the other hand, Shortugai, as representative of the Indus civilization in Central Asia, near the Oxus civilization, displays the better possible links as expected for a Maracasi or Marahasi land located on the territory of the Oxus Basin and the BMAC. Not only is the Meluha vicinity clear for the Shortugai period 1, Indus with all its regalia, architecture, pottery, beads, bangles, animal, vegetable, and mineral resources, and other animals, domesticated animals such as water buffalo, zebu, and domesticated crops such as flax and seeds. But periods 2 and even 3, which is again from 2000 BC, for Shortugai, provide that during the end of this period, there was cultural interaction and cultural intermixing in this wider region. So this is important. Now, in previous lectures, I have traced out the world system in a sense. In this period, we are operating in prehistory for most of these civilizations, for the Harappan civilization, for the Oxus civilization. But in Mesopotamia, we have entered the historical period, and we begin to get some texts related to the various adventures and exploits of various kings and great heroes. And these kings, these texts, they mention some lands which the Sumerians interacted with. I mentioned the land of Meluha, which most likely was the Indus Valley Civilization. In fact, almost certainly was the Indus Valley Civilization. I mentioned Dilmun, which was possibly located around Bahrain. Again, most likely located around Bahrain. And then, of course, I mentioned Magan, which was in southern Arabia and present-day Oman, and possibly also extended across the Straits of Oman into the Makran coast. One of the mysteries, of course, has been where to place this land of Marahasi or Markhasi. But as H.P. Francfort hypothesizes, this was possibly what the Oxus civilization was known as to the Mesopotamians. And this becomes important because in later texts we will see that the vicinity between Meluha and Marahasi also is interpreted in some texts as an alliance between the Meluhans and the Maracasi. In fact, in one of the upcoming presentations, I'm going to explore a possible world war which involved the first empire based in Mesopotamia, that was the empire of the Akkadians founded by Sargon of Akkad, and on the other side was an alliance of the Elamites, which of course we know were founded in southern Iran, were located in southern Iran, the Meluhans, and these mysterious people from the land of Maracasi. And if the land of Maracasi or Marahasi can be located in the Oxus civilization, then perhaps we are in fact looking at a civilizational world war in the 3rd millennium BC. And this is something that I'm going to explore in an upcoming presentation. Why not the next one? So the next one is going to be devoted to that, perhaps the First World War in 2300 BC. Over the past few decades, our understanding of the emergence of human civilization has undergone a radical paradigm shift. Now, the prevalent model, which emerged sometime around the mid-20th century and was prevalent till the 80s or 90s, was to understand the emergence of civilization through a series of stages of revolutions, such as the agricultural revolution and the urban revolution, which happened sometime around the 2nd or even the 1st millennium BC in certain places and then gradually spread through a series of exchanges to other places. So the place where this urban revolution was identified as happening was, of course, Mesopotamia, where the earliest cities were found, especially in Sumeria. And of course, the agricultural revolution was seen as a moment in time in the history of the emergence of civilization, which happened in the Fertile Crescent. But now, in the past few decades, we see the emergence of civilization through a much larger picture or a broader framework. So the fundamental shift is to move away from the revolution model to the process model. And civilization is seen as a series of processes which happened over a much, much longer period of time and was spread out over a much vaster space. So this time frame is roughly after the Ice Age, or in the period known as the Holocene. And the broader area where these processes and the interactions between these processes occurred between different people in different places is this broad region from the eastern Mediterranean to northern India, of course spreading northwards into some parts of Eurasia and even northern China. And yet another shift is in the very idea of civilization itself. Now, earlier, civilization was understood as referring to especially ancient cities, which were based on intensive agriculture and a strict hierarchy of or a bureaucracy. Now, civilization is seen as more of a fluid concept, which deals with culture, various sets of ideas, and structures of organizing society which persists through time. So, we don't really think of civilization as something that happens only in cities. Civilization could also happen outside in the wide open spaces. Now, remember, when we're talking about ancient times, these sites or cities or settlements based on agriculture are small islands which are suspended in this vast space, which is inhabited by various other types of people, the so called nomads or even the barbarians. Now we understand that in this long range of time, in the post Holocene period, right up to perhaps the 14th, 15th, and even 16th century AD, civilization has emerged through the interaction of these settled societies and these moving and nomadic societies. So, just going a little bit back in time, just think of the Mongol Empire and think about the patterns of exchange in technology and culture and the creation of the Silk Road or the reinvigoration of the ancient Silk Road that was initiated by the Mongol Empire, which in a sense kicked off the modernization process or the early modernization process in Eurasia, which was later carried on. So these nomadic civilizations were earlier seen as living in some isolated space and time and suddenly dropping into history now and then to ravage settled societies and destroy them. But now we have to see civilization in a much more nuanced way, especially through the interfacing and interactions of settled and moving societies, which again, like I said, happens throughout history from the earliest times in the post-Holocene till very, very recently. And the way I see it, the places or the spaces of civilization's emergence that I find most interesting are spaces of frontier zones where different civilizations interact and different types of civilizations interact. Now, in an earlier lecture in this series, which is of course the Deep History of Civilization series, I gave these two types of civilizations two names. So I called the domesticated or settled agriculture-based life the domus type of civilization. Domus, of course, is a root word from which we get domesticated. And I called the moving or the nomadic type of civilization. Now, nomadic is not the right word for it, but let's just use it for now. I call that the Ordos type of people. Now, of course, the Ordos is a word which I again take from the Mongols, and it referred to the horde or the camp, which was the seat of the Khan in a sense. It was his moving palace. And it is from the word Ordos, in fact, that we get the word horde or the moving horde of the nomadic people. So these domus and Ordos types of lifestyles again developed in the post-Holocene era. Now, in the post-Holocene era, that is after the Ice Age, we have settled agricultural life, and we have these transhuman populations, which are pastoralists or hunters who have these patterns of movement in vast spaces based upon seasonal rhythms, the rhythms of the moving of animal herds, and of course, also the pattern of the circulation of trade. Because one of the important interfaces that we see in history is that these moving people, these Ordos people, often act as the carriers of trade between settled societies. So this is how this world system, this ancient world system which we have been exploring, emerges through the cooperation or the interfacing of these domus and Ordos people.